and welcome back to Behind the Cues, the podcast where we talk about everything that happens behind the scenes in theatre, from things the audience gets to see outside. From the things the audience gets to see to the absolute chaos that they have no idea is happening backstage. I'm Tom, your host, and today we're talking about something that I think is really interesting because it's one of those things that the audience probably never thinks about. You've watched the show, you've seen the curtain come down, everyone claps, the actors come out for their bows, and then you go home. But what happens after that? Because obviously the theatre doesn't just magically reset itself. There's still a massive amount of work that has to happen, and depending on whether that was the final performance or whether you've got another show the next day, you're either doing a get out or you're doing a reset. Before we get into this episode, if you're a newbie to theatre, I want to help educate and explain what goes into theatre. Brace yourself, this one is a little long, but whether you're sat at home, doing a get out, or in the wardrobe department fixing costumes, chuck me on in the background. Who knows, you might learn a thing or two. So, before we get into the different departments, it's probably worth explaining what I actually mean by get out. Because if you're not involved in theatre, get out probably sounds a little bit rude. Basically, a get out is just the process of taking the production out of a venue once the run has finished. So you've got your get in, which is when you arrive at the theatre, build everything, get the set in, rig the lighting, sort the costumes, get all the props in, and basically turn an empty stage into the production. Then you've got the get out, which is pretty much doing all of that backwards. You're taking everything apart, packing everything away, and getting it out of the building. Usually, there's a meeting before the final performance where everyone gets told what's happening during the get out. You'll have a plan for who's responsible for what, and obviously all the health and safety stuff that you need. And then, once that final curtain comes down and the audiences have gone home, that's when everyone gets to work. Depending on the size of the production, that can take hours. Sometimes you've got 4 or 5 hours, sometimes you've got the entire night, and on a much larger production, it can take considerably longer. You've got all the different departments working at the same time, so it can look like absolute chaos if you don't know what's going on. But usually everyone knows exactly what they're supposed to be doing. And that's the important thing, really. It might look chaotic, but there's normally a plan. Now, if you've got another performance the next day, you don't do any of that. You're not taking the set apart and putting the costumes into boxes if you're going to need them again in 12 hours. Instead, you do what's called a reset. And that's basically getting everything back to exactly where it needs to be so that the next performance can start as though nothing happened. So, I thought I'd go through a few of the different departments and talk about what actually happens. And obviously, I'm going to start with my favourite department, costume. As you probably know by now, costume is my very much go-to department. I've only had temporary experience working in costume at uni, but I've always really enjoyed it, and I feel like I've picked up a fair bit about what goes into getting a production in, and more importantly for this episode, getting it back out again. So, let's imagine we've just finished the final performance. At East 15, we normally have our different dressing rooms, and each dressing room would have its own rail with all the costumes for the actors used in that space. During the get-in, we'd have a checklist of all the characters and the actors playing them, and we'd use that to organise everything. And that checklist becomes incredibly useful when you get to the get out, because you've basically got a list telling you what should be there. The costumes would normally be organised by character, or actor, depending on how the dressing rooms were set up, and you'd have everything together. And when I say everything, I don't just mean the actual clothes. You've got the shoes, you've got the jewelry, hats, bags, belts, accessories, all of those little things that can quite easily get lost. We'd usually put those sorts of things into clear labelled bags and hang them on the rail alongside the costume they belong to, which sounds very organised until you get to the end and you're looking at a random shoe thinking, I know this belongs to someone, but I have absolutely no idea who. Once everything is accounted for, the rails can be covered with rail bags and then they can be moved out and loaded into whatever transport is being used. At East 15, that would usually mean getting everything back to the costume store where it could be sorted through that evening or the following day. It's usually the following day, depending on what was happening. And this is where you start separating everything out. You've got things that need repairing, things that need laundering, and things that are perfectly fine and can just go straight back into storage. And the inspection is really important, especially if you're dealing with hired costumes. Something might have looked absolutely fine during the performance, but after being worn repeatedly, you might suddenly find a split seam, a missing button, or a broken zip. A stain, or some mysterious substance that nobody wants to admit came from them. You need to know what condition everything is in before it gets returned. And if something belongs to a hire company, there may be particular requirements for how it needs to be cleaned or repaired before it goes back. So it's not just a case of putting everything back on the rail and going home. There's quite a lot that happens after the audience has left. And I think that's something people don't necessarily realise about costume. As an audience member, you see someone walk on stage wearing a dress or a jacket, or whatever their costume is. But backstage, there's this entire system keeping that costume going. Someone has organised it, someone has maintained it, someone has cleaned it, someone has repaired it, and eventually someone has to get it back to where it came from. And if you've got an entire cast worth of costumes, well, good luck finding that missing left shoe. But what about the West End? Now, obviously, that's based largely on my own experience at East 15. If you move into a professional space, particularly somewhere like the West End, the basic idea is still the same, but the scale can be completely different. You've potentially got hundreds of costumes, multiple casts, understudies, swings, quick changes, and costumes coming from different suppliers or hire companies. So you really can't just rely on someone remembering where everything came from. There'll normally be a detailed costume list and inventories so that the department can keep track of everything. At the end of the run, costumes are taken out of the dressing rooms and backstage areas and sorted according to where they're going. Something hired from a costume house needs to go back there. Something belonging to the production might be stored, sold, donated, or moved to another venue. And then you've got all the cleaning and repairs. Every costume needs to be checked for things like stains, damages, missing buttons, all that stuff. And you can't necessarily just put everything into a washing machine because some costumes will need specialist cleaning or a particular treatment. Once everything has been cleaned and repaired, it can be packed up and sent to wherever it's supposed to go. That's where the professional get out becomes a proper logistical operation. You've got rails, boxes, labels, transport, different suppliers, different departments, and lots of people all trying to get things done at the same time. So communication becomes really important. Because the show might have finished, but the costume are still standing there sorting through hundreds of pairs of trousers. It's basically the world's most complicated version of tidying your bedroom, except everything belongs to somebody else, and somebody is probably asking where their trousers are. Obviously, you don't do all of that every night. If you've got another performance tomorrow, then you're doing a reset instead. And the basic idea of a reset is when the next performance starts, everything needs to be exactly where it needs to be. So once the actors have finished, the costume team will go through the dressing rooms and backstage areas and start putting everything back. Anything that's been worn needs to be checked, and depending on the costume, it might need airing, cleaning, or sending to laundry. If something has been damaged, that needs to be flagged straight away, because a missing button might seem like a tiny problem until you realise that the actor needs that costume in the opening scene tomorrow. And then everything gets put back on the correct rail. Shoes go together, jewellery goes back into its label bag, hats go back to where they belong, and anything that's needed for a quick change goes back into exactly the position the dresser needs it. Because if you've got 30 seconds to get an actor out of one costume and into another, you really don't want to be looking around going, where the hell is the other shoe? There might also be repairs or maintenance happening overnight. Something might need stitching, steaming, pressing, or replacing. Wigs might need attention, shoes might need cleaning, and all of that needs to be sorted before the next performance. This is where communication is really important as well. If something went wrong during the performance, the costume department needs to know about it, because you don't want to discover 5 minutes before curtain that something hasn't been repaired. And really, that's what a good reset is. You put everything back exactly where it needs to be so that tomorrow's performance can start exactly like tonight's did. The audience doesn't know that anyone has done it, and that's kind of the point. Now, let's move over to stage management, because this is where we start dealing with a lot more than just clothes. At East 15, stage management could end up being responsible for props, set dressing, toolkits, food kits, consumables, scripts, paperwork, and basically anything else that somehow ended up backstage. And when you finish the production, all of that needs to be dealt with. Let's start with props. You'd go through the prop list and make sure everything that came into the production has been accounted for. And I mean everything. You'd be checking the props tables, backstage areas, dressing rooms, and anywhere else something might have ended up. Anything belonging to the school or venue goes back into the correct storage area. Anything hired or borrowed gets separated out so it can be returned. And anything bought specifically for the production gets dealt with according to whatever was agreed. Then you've got set dressing. That's all the little things that make the set look like an actual place, rather than just a load of scenery. Pictures, books, ornaments, lamps, furniture, rugs, whatever it may be. If the stage management has brought it in, then it needs to be removed and either returned, stored, disposed of, or handed back to the appropriate department. Then you've got the kits. And this is one of those things that you don't necessarily think about until you're standing there at the end of the production wondering where everything has gone. You've got your toolkit, your food kit, consumables, and all of those little backstage essentials. The toolkit needs to be checked so that everything you've borrowed or been given is actually back where it belongs. The food kit needs sorting too. Anything that can be stored gets put away. Anything that's expired or no longer usable gets disposed of. And the kit itself gets cleaned and put away ready for the next production. And then obviously there's paperwork, because stage management cannot escape paperwork. Even when the show is finished, you've got your prompt copy, rehearsal notes, prop lists, costume list, contact sheet, risk assessments, running paperwork, and all the other bits and pieces that you've accumulated throughout the production. Some of that might be archived, some returned to the production office, and some can eventually be filed away or disposed of, depending on the procedures you're working under. And I have to say, the prompt copy is always a weird one. You spent weeks writing in this thing, highlighting cues, sticking post-it notes everywhere, changing blocking, adding notes, and then suddenly the show is over. So yes, technically it needs to be put away, but I'm absolutely keeping those cue sheets. Once all of that has been dealt with, stage management would do a final sweep of the backstage areas. Props accounted for, set dressing gone, tools counted, food kit cleaned, paperwork sorted, and then you've got that random water bottle that has been backstage for 3 weeks, which frankly is probably best left where it is. If the show is continuing though, you're not doing all of that. You're resetting. And the basic aim of a stage management reset is to make sure that when the next performance starts, everything is exactly where it should be. Props are probably the biggest part of it, because props have a habit of traveling. Something starts on the props table, gets taken onto stage, gets handed to an actor, disappears backstage, and somehow ends up on the other side of the building. So after the performance, you're going through your prop list and putting everything back. Prop tables get reset, consumables get replaced, anything that has moved gets put back into position. And this is why having a decent prop list is so important, because you don't want to be standing backstage thinking, I swear there was a banana here, especially when the banana is needed in the opening scene tomorrow. Set dressing gets reset too. Chairs go back to where they started. Tables are put back. Pictures and ornaments are returned to their positions. And if something has been knocked over or moved, then it gets put back. Even something tiny like a picture frame being slightly crooked can matter if it's supposed to be in a specific position, i.e. if it's being projected on or the actor needs to move it. Then you're checking your kits and consumables. Food and drink might need replacing. Something that gets used or destroyed every night needs to be replenished. Tape, batteries, stationery, and all of those little things that you don't think about until you've run out of them need checking. And then you've got your backstage areas. They need to be tidy and clear, because backstage clutter isn't just annoying, it's a safety issue. You've got actors moving around, crew moving equipment, quick changes happening. You really don't want to be someone tripping over something because nobody bothered to put it away. And of course, you've got the paperwork. If something went wrong during the show, you record it. If a prop broke, you record it. If something went missing, you record it. If there's a problem that needs fixing before tomorrow, you record it. Because if you tell yourself, I'll remember in the morning, you will not. So eventually you get into the final check. Everything is where it should be. The backstage areas are safe. The props are set. The paperwork is updated and the production is ready to go again. And that's really the beauty of a good reset. The audience will never know it happened. They walk into the theatre the next day, the lights go down, the curtain goes up, and the show starts exactly where it did the night before. Meanwhile, backstage, a whole team has spent the last hour making sure every little thing is exactly where it needs to be. I could go into a lot more detail about lighting and sound, but I'm going to be honest here. I don't have anywhere near as much hands-on experience in those departments as I do with costume, props, and stage management. So I don't want to sit here preaching that I'm some sort of lighting or sound expert, so I'm going to keep this brief. With lighting, between performances, the team will check that the rig is still in the correct state, that fixtures are working, and that anything that's been moved during the performance has been put back. They also make sure the lighting desk and cues are ready for the next performance. For a full get-out, obviously, that's much bigger. You've got fixtures, cables, lanterns, and accessories that need to be de-rigged, packed away, and returned to wherever they're supposed to go. Sound is similar. Between performances, microphones need to be returned, batteries replaced or charged, radio equipment checked, and the sound system made ready for the next show. For the get out, everything needs to be disconnected, packed, and accounted for. Microphones, speakers, cables, mixing equipment, playback systems, all of it. So really, although I can't give you a massive technical breakdown, the principle is basically the same. You reset it, you check it, you maintain it, and you make sure it's ready to go again. And when the production finishes, you pack it up, account for everything, and get it out of the building. Finally, you've got construction and scenery. This is probably one of the biggest part of a get out because you've potentially got a whole stage full of things that needs to be dismantled and removed. At East 15, we tried to be as sustainable as we could. We'd often look at what we already had in the workshops and stores and see whether pieces could be adapted or reused in another production, rather than building something completely new and then throwing it away at the end. And actually, that's something that the professional industry is increasingly thinking about too. When a larger West End production closes, the set doesn't necessarily get thrown into a skip. There are a few different possibilities. If the production is touring, transferring to another theatre, or being remounted somewhere else, the set might simply be packed up and transported to its next destination. Which makes sense when you think about how much money, time, and labour has gone into building it. If it's not travelling with the production, then the production team might look at what can be stored, reused, sold, donated, or recycled. Some theatres have their own stores, and productions can also use external storage facilities. And sometimes parts of set can have a completely different life in another production. A flat might be used again, a platform might be adapted, timber or ply might be taken apart and used to build something else. And I think that's where sustainability becomes really interesting. Ideally, you are thinking about the future life of the set from the beginning, not just how do we build this, but also what happens to this when we're finished. Can it be dismantled? Can it be reused? Can it be adapted? Can the materials be recycled? Because the ideal situation is that the set has multiple lives rather than just one. Obviously, though, not everything can be saved. Some scenery is incredibly bespoke. It might only work in a particular theatre, or it might be made from materials that aren't practical to reuse. Sometimes the set has been modified so heavily during the production that there's not much left that can realistically be used again. And sometimes the best thing you can do is design a set differently from the beginning. Instead of building one huge structure that only works for one production, you can think about modular elements that can be taken apart or reconfigured. And we've seen examples of this working professionally. Chichester Festival Theatre, for example, reported that for its 2025 production of Magic, 61% of the set was made from reused or recycled materials, and 79% was stored for future reuse. So when we talk about construction get out, it's not necessarily, right, the show's finished, smash everything up. It's more the case of asking what can be kept, what can be reused, what can somebody else use, what can be recycled, and only when there's generally no other option, what actually needs to be thrown away. That's something we're already trying to practice at East 15. Obviously, we were working on a much smaller scale, but the principle is still the same. If something can have a second life, why wouldn't you give it one? Because the best get out isn't necessarily the one where you've completely emptied the theatre. It's the one where you've managed to make sure that as little as possible ends up in the bin. So I think that's probably a good place to wrap things up today. We've covered what happens during a get out, what happens when a show needs to be reset, and what all the different departments are getting up to once the final curtain comes down. Because for the audience, the curtain falling usually means the show is over. But backstage, that's when the work really begins. Costumes get packed away, props get returned, scenery gets dismantled, lights and sound get de-rigged, and slowly the world that took weeks or months to create starts to disappear. And I think that's one of the things I love most about theatre. You create this entire world, you let an audience experience it for a couple of hours, and then you take it all apart and get ready to do it again with another show. So next time you're sitting in the audience and the curtain comes down, just remember the curtain might have fallen, but backstage the get out has only just begun. If you've enjoyed this episode, please feel free to share it with all your friends and leave a review or a comment. It really does help the podcast out. And you can find me over on TikTok and Instagram at Tom Does Theatre for more theatre and backstage content. But for now, I've been Tom. This has been Behind the Cues, and I'll talk to you in the next one. Bye-bye.